Wednesday, welcome into lcpioneers.com live, presented by PioStream, as we are with you 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific Time on Facebook Live, and available to watch on demand. Visit the fan zone at lcpioneers.com. You can also check out all of our past shows on our YouTube page, youtube.com/lcpios, keeping you connected with student athletes, coaches, alumni, and members of our Lewis and Clark College community. Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Goff. I am the play-by-play voice and director of athletic communications for Lewis and Clark, the Pioneers based out of Portland, Oregon, and competing across 19 intercollegiate athletics programs in the Northwest Conference with other institutions from Northwest Oregon and the state of Washington, and a member of NCAA Division III. So Lewis and Clark competes with over 430 other institutions at the Division III level, a chance for our student athletes to experience competition on a national level. And certainly during non-pandemic times, Lewis and Clark's robust overseas study program, a chance for our students and student athletes alike to go around the globe with experiential liberal arts education. I'm sure most are eager for that opportunity as soon as it's safe to do so. Sophia Stringer will be our guest today, a first-year women's rower, and we'll have a chance to talk about transition to rowing from some other sports. In fact, we've said this on the show before. Rowing is a neat intercollegiate athletics program because there's avenues to get to it that are unlike many others. For example, first-year novice opportunity. And so we'll talk to Sophia about that, some of her past, and certainly her experience in usually male-dominated or white-dominated sports. Those are some topics that we'll discuss today with Sophia in just a few minutes. We invite you to get in touch with the show, and you can do so through our Facebook Live comments. You can also email us anytime, sports@lclark.edu, if you have a suggestion for a future guest or you have a question for one of our guests on the show. You can always let us know via those channels. There's also our Twitter and Instagram, both of the handles there, LC Pioneers. One thing that we do want to share with you this morning is on Monday, a joint statement posted by Lewis and Clark and Willamette, the programs both coming together to share kind of the plan for the spring 2021 season when it comes to high-risk sports. It reads in the joint statement, in consideration of restrictions in the state of Oregon and the health and safety of our student athletes in wider campus and local communities, Lewis and Clark and Willamette announced with regret the cancellation of their football and men's and women's basketball seasons for 2020-21. We understand this news is disappointing to our students and campus communities. State restrictions on competition are unlikely to change as football and basketball are considered high-risk sports by the NCAA, and the experiences of some colleges and universities have shown this to be true, even with strong safety protocols in place. This difficult decision was made after discussions with our Northwest Conference colleagues. We will continue to work with the Oregon Health Authority and the Northwest Conference to develop plans to return, if possible, to safe competition for lesser risk sports. For those student athletes not competing this spring, we will continue to find meaningful ways to engage in athletic and physical opportunities. And we should mention too, our COVID page updated at lcpioneers.com/COVID. The updates pertaining to athletics specifically on that page at lcpioneers.com. There's also links through to NCAA announcements, Northwest Conference announcements, and also to Lewis and Clark College's ongoing COVID response as well. So certainly disappointing news, but we will continue to do the best we can to supply those meaningful opportunities as mentioned in that statement. I do want to shout out one student athlete, Rhodes Scholar finalist, Jordan Gonzalez, a pitcher in his senior academic year for Lewis and Clark baseball. Double major in mathematics and chemistry, and was recently announced the Rhodes Scholar finalist. And that's significant too, because all three of Lewis and Clark's Rhodes Scholar winners have come from the student athlete realm. And then yesterday we had our interview with Quincy Bowman, a sophomore for Pio's women's golf. That interview, as well as all of our past interviews, available to watch on demand at youtube.com/lcpios. So with that said, let's bring in our guest for today, a first-year women's rower. We're excited to welcome Sophia Stringer to the show. And Sophia, appreciate you taking the time to join us. And it's interesting because most of our interviews on the show have not been first-year student athletes because I haven't had a chance to meet many of you. And so this is neat because I get a chance to introduce myself. Yesterday we had a chance to connect. In fall 2020, the semester, your first semester, is coming to a close with today being the last day of finals. So let's just kind of start out at the top. How are you doing with your fall 2020 semester?
Well, I wanted to say thank you, Ryan, so much for having me. Fall 2020 was a bumpy road. I believe, like, easily for all students. As a first year going into college, it was a bit extreme because a lot of the times college is like romanticized. Like you'll find friends and have late night study sessions in common rooms and things like that. But COVID definitely put a kink in that. But overall, it's been pretty good. All the professors have been really, uh, they work really hard to communicate with their students and provide office hours. And they understand that it's mentally straining on students and they try to balance that with the workload.
Well, and I think that is well deserving of a kudos in the sense that, yeah, I mean, the transition from high school to college can be difficult enough sometimes, let alone with all the variables that have been out there, whether it's a pandemic or even in the state of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest dealing with wildfires. And we may get to that, but I do want to ask you, you're from Whittier, California. What was it about the opportunity to study at Lewis and Clark that appealed to you?
Well, when I was applying to colleges, my parents always had like this rule, like 5 state away minimum. Uh, they always joke. They just wanted us to like always branch out, and yeah, they accepted that we could be local, but they believed that going away for college provided significant amount of growth. My mom went to school back east. My dad stayed local, but they both agreed that going away is beneficial. When I was applying to colleges, I definitely looked at more traditional schools in the sense of like old buildings and lots of greenery. And what appealed to me about Lewis and Clark is that I had that in comparison to like an East Coast school. Yes, East Coast, East Coast schools are green and they're lush and they're old New England buildings and they're beautiful. But what appealed to me about Lewis and Clark is that I had that in addition to modern buildings as well. And on top of it, it was close to a metropolitan area and it was just astounding.
We're talking to Sophia Stringer on lcpioneers.com live, a freshman for women's rowing at Lewis and Clark. And I mentioned this as I introed the segment, about the idea of rowing. I love some of the paths that student athletes use to get into the rowing program at Lewis and Clark. So let me ask you, what was your path into the rowing program and what was your first year like with the team?
So, um, it's not the most traditional sense. Previously, I used to do martial arts for about 6, 7 years, and I hold some belt rankings in Taekwondo. And then I also did mixed martial arts. So I did Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, Muay Thai. And then going into high school, I was like, I really love martial arts. It's a passion of mine. And I love the physical aspect of it and pushing yourself to the limits without like feeling accomplished by your own goals. Because when you're out there, like whether it be competing or even practicing, you have no one else to rely on but yourself. And those wins and losses, those are on you. And going into high school, sure, there's like volleyball and soccer and golf and more traditional sports like that. But I had a martial arts background and I didn't know how to translate those, and nor have I ever played soccer, volleyball, basketball, or any other sport that is very traditional. And yeah, I did run for a bit on my own, and I done half marathons and 5Ks, 10Ks, and stuff like that. But running is very difficult. Um, and I just always felt my happiest doing martial arts. So I believe like the best way to translate that into high school was doing wrestling. My high school team didn't have like a separate men's and women's team, but rather it was just straight co-ed. And I ended up being one of four females on the team. And I also ended up being the only black individual on the team. So that was a bit of a transition, but it's not something I would fear away from.
And
So,
it's interesting that you bring that up because I haven't heard that path even through the first year rower path is I haven't met somebody who had gone through wrestling and martial arts type sports and transition into rowing. I'm curious, what was it about the opportunity to row in college that appealed to you?
For sure. When it came to rowing at Lewis and Clark, I knew that it was one of those sports that you could transition as it being a Division 3 school, and it had a very welcoming community. And going into college, I was looking for either a wrestling like club or sports team that I could possibly join, and then there wasn't. And to an extent, I was a bit sad, and I was like, I could start my own. Lewis and Clark is very welcoming. But then I also decided to take the opportunity to try something new. The reason why I stopped wrestling to begin with is because I was actually injured and I tore a ligament while wrestling, and I was I was afraid to an extent to put my body through that again, and the possibility of being like re-injured or injured in a different way that could potentially be worse in the long run. And so when it came to rowing, I knew it was as physically challenging. It's an endurance sport, and I wasn't afraid to be a minority in a team setting because I experienced that for 2, 3 years while wrestling.
We're talking to Sophia Stringer, our guest on lcpioneers.com live, first year women's rower, and discussing this transition from wrestling to the boat. And with rowing, I'm curious, have you found that rowing has kind of filled that void that you were getting from the other sports you had competed in?
Most definitely. Wrestling, martial arts, and even rowing, they all contribute to like my stress, like my de-stress mentality. I use it as a way to kind of like find my inner zen and peace. And at least when I'm doing something active, I could like focus in on that and not worry about any of the stress outside of me. And so I'm really grateful for sports in that sense. So when I after I ended wrestling and I wanted to try something new, I wanted to try something new that was also physically challenging. And rowing has unbelievably filled that void, if not more. I feel like I have a bigger community at Lewis and Clark than I did wrestling or even doing martial arts. And even now, like those sports, martial arts and wrestling, are very individualistic, while rowing is more of a team dynamic. And I've never been a part of that before. And it's beyond encouraging, and I would recommend it to anyone.
Now, as we talk about the fall 2020 and how unusual you mentioned it was just in general being a first year student in your first semester, I'm curious from a practice standpoint, what was it about the fall 2020, some of the challenges that the team had in terms of training and trying to make things as normal as it can be in a pandemic situation?
Well, it's a bit discouraging uh, to know that we never actually went on the water fall 2020 because of the pandemic. So we practice on an erg rowing machine, and that's how we practice 5 times a week. And then on top of it, we did weights. So it was still physically challenging. And one of the benefits about an erg is that you're able to monitor your own, like your rates and your own, like your own rates and your own speed and things like that. Um, but I definitely would have wished that we went on the water.
Yeah, well, and hopefully as soon as we possibly can, I'm sure we are as eager as we can to get you that opportunity. And it's amazing setting too, with the Willamette River and getting a chance to hang out with the rowing teams the few times I have. I'm excited for you to experience that for sure. One thing that you mentioned too is this history in wrestling, and then you transition into rowing. And when I think of wrestling, I think of a very male dominated sport, and then even with rowing, in all realities, that sport has tended to be white dominated. And you mentioned being the only black athlete on the wrestling team. So, kind of describe your experience in the regard of being, a minority, both as a woman and a black student in those situations.
Hmm. When I first started wrestling, I was told that there was only about 40. schools in the like colleges, universities in the country that accept women wrestling. Uh, and so I knew that wrestling in college was going to be a slim opportunity unless it was going to be in the Midwest somewhere. And that was almost heartbreaking to know that there wasn't a lot of women opportunities in that space to begin with. And I'm not sure about you or the audience, but I know when it comes to me, I think of wrestling as white. I think of a white, stocky, heavy male that's muscular and probably has blonde hair and blue eyes. Um, and to break that stereotype, like when I would introduce myself as a wrestler, people would always like gasp and be and shocked that A, I would wrestle because I am a woman, and B, I'm wrestling because I'm a black woman. And on top of that, like I wasn't stocky. I wrestled at 126, sometimes at 121. And so I was on the lighter side when it came to wrestling. Um, so it just kind of broke that stereotype, and that honestly felt like a good. It felt good because I knew I was helping or setting. I was helping set an example for someone younger than me, or I was helping people open their minds to the possibilities of someone that looked like me in a male-dominated space. When it, excuse me, when it came to excuse me, when it came to rowing, is what I'm trying to say. I had that same image of a white man, but this time he was tall. He was kind of like a frat boy type mentality. He was like 6 foot. Um, and let's face it, rowing is a very like wealthy sport. It's similar to golf that it has like that financial standing and that financial backing. And with Lewis and Clark, you don't feel that economic divide within students. Like I'm fortunate enough to be pretty well off, like uh, when it comes to economic standings, but I know that's not the same for some of my peers. And what I appreciate about Lewis and Clark is that you don't feel that economic divide. And with the rowing team, you have like from my practice sections, we had to break this up due to COVID regulations. We had female dominated spaces from international students to LGBT students, students that were ethnic minorities, and that's what I appreciated.
We're talking to Sophia Stringer on lcpioneers.com live, first year student athlete for women's rowing. And the national conversation around racism, systemic racism, continues, especially over the course of the pandemic since the murder of George Floyd, dating back to the spring and early summer of this year. And so, kind of shifting from sports to more of like a general life perspective, it's so great to hear your voice and your thoughts on how race and being a woman competing in a male dominated space in sports comes out. What is the impact? How have you been impacted in terms of systemic racism?
Um, maybe it's hard to describe because my parents have tried their best to shield me from systemic racism, but it's hard. For them, they grew up in poverty and they are both people of color. My dad is Black American, my mother is Mexican American. So they faced it differently. And with their education, they've grown to a higher economic standing. And with me, they try to shield it the best that they can. But the reality is, I'm a Black woman in America. And I'm going to face it, whether it be the butt of the joke and be like, oh, I'm an inappropriate joke being made and they use me as being Black or either a woman or being a Black woman as like the punchline. And that is definitely hurtful, but it does add a bit of resilience to my skin and it definitely makes my skin thicker. And it's like I get stared at stores and followed around, and that's unfortunate, but it's reality. When it comes to a sports setting, when it comes to rowing and when it comes to wrestling and martial arts, I am once again a minority in those settings. But what I'm grateful for my upbringing is that my parents have taught me to not use my race and not use my sex as a way to shy away from something that I want. They want me to be a go getter and they want me to challenge myself. And I'm grateful that I'm in those spaces too, because I think the best way to be comfortable is to initially be uncomfortable in those spaces. Um, and it helps break the stereotypes and it helps be more inclusive and to say to see that there's a black woman in a male dominated space. I feel like I could be an example for other people of color, other women to also get in spaces.
Well, we certainly appreciate you opening up, bringing your voice to our show. We've had some discussions around the topic of systemic racism on this show, and while this platform is by no means huge, it certainly is a platform that we are excited to have our student athletes on. And Sophia, I certainly appreciate you bringing your voice to this. One thing I would like to ask you about from like the academic side of things is it sounds like maybe psychology is the path that you're interested in pursuing. It's your first fall semester, right? So I don't know how, in stone that is, but give me an idea of why psychology, at least at the beginning, is the front runner for the path that you want to study.
Well, in high school, I did take AP psychology, and I fell in love with like the course and the teacher that I had brought it to life. And unfortunately, I have yet to take a psychology course at Lewis and Clark that comes spring semester. Um, but it's still the front runner because, like, I find it interesting to understand why humans behave the way that they do. And my goal down the line is either to be a lawyer or a psychologist or a physician. But I want to work with people and I want to find out the root of their problems and I want to find out ways that I can help them, whether it be physically or like as a physician or mentally as a psychologist or whatever the case.
Well, good luck down that path. Certainly, as it's the last day of finals in the first semester, and what, as we've mentioned, has been a very odd semester. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm excited to finally get to meet you at some point down the road on campus, and I appreciate all that you've brought in your first semester at Lewis and Clark. Sophia Stringer, thank you so much for joining us on lcpioneers.com live.
Thank you so much for having me and have a good day. Stay safe.
Likewise, absolutely. Appreciate your time. That was a really insightful conversation, and the first time that I met Sophia was through FaceTime yesterday as we were discussing what we wanted to share on the show, and the amount of insight and perspective that she brings with her perspective as a black student athlete, as a woman, and competing in those male dominated or white dominated spaces was really interesting, and I couldn't ask for more in terms of sharing that with us on our show. So big thanks to our first year student from women's rowing, Sophia Stringer, and looking forward to, like I said, getting to meet all of our first year student athletes as soon as it's possibly safe to do so. That was one aspect of this year that was odd. There was no competition through the first half of the academic year, and it's something that I truly miss, is getting a chance to interact with the student athletes on a day in and day out basis, and certainly am eager to do so as soon as things are safe to do so. And in that regard, like I mentioned at the top, we are inviting you to go to lcpioneers.com/COVID, which is our coronavirus website. Updates specific to athletics are on that page. And recently, an announcement from Lewis and Clark and Willamette regarding high-risk sports, football, and both men's and women's basketball, as there will be no competition for the 2020-2021 academic year. We'll continue to update you on anything else in that regard. The Northwest Conference releasing a statement as well on Tuesday. That information at lcpioneers.com/COVID. Coming up for the rest of the week, we will talk to head coach of women's soccer, Jim Tersey, one of the longer tenured coaches at Lewis and Clark, and the second time that Coach Tersey will join us on the show. That's coming up tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. And then Brian Detweiler-Bedell, who is the director of the Bates Center for Entrepreneurship, will join us coming up on Friday. Excited to get insight, not only what the Bates Center provides all of the students at Lewis and Clark, but also a look ahead to the Winterim, which is coming up, a 1-week course for students at Lewis and Clark. usually held in the middle of January. So until we see you again tomorrow for our show, I'm Ryan Goff. Thank you for having fun. Thank you for watching with us today. And big thanks again to Sophia Stringer for joining us on the show. If you miss anything, you can always find our past shows to watch on demand at lcpioneers.com. Click on the fan zone. There's a link to lcpioneers.com live. Or, of course, you can subscribe and check out the show on YouTube as well, youtube.com/lcpios. Until we see you again tomorrow for the show, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Hi, I'm Nick Lombardi. Something I've learned at Winterim this year is how to communicate a vision.
My biggest takeaway from Winterim is probably the networking. Getting to talk to everybody, connect with people for the future is one of the most valuable things, and I did Winterim last year, came back for more this year.
I think a way in which my liberal arts education has really helped me and my group formulate our ideas is that concept of critical thinking and having many different backgrounds. Me being an econ major and my two group mates being chemistry majors, we really get that well-rounded background, well-rounded ideas.
I think overall it's absolutely worth doing. You find yourself not only being more prepared for, say, well, this next semester, on top of being more prepared for life in general.